Hematopoiesis is a term that means forming blood cells. Hemato or hemo as a word root has to do with blood. Poiesis means forming or creating. So that's how we get the term hematopoiesis. We're talking about all blood cells, not just erythrocytes. So hematopoiesis is the formation of red, white blood cells and platelets. Hematopoiesis occurs in our bone marrow. Most of our bone marrow, red bone marrow, I should say, in infants, but once we get to adults, it's only specific spongy bone, red bone marrow, and that's in the girdles, shoulder and hip girdles, and in the epiphyses of the humerus and femur, proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femur. That's where most of the hematopoiesis takes place. So this tissue is reticular connective tissue, if you think back to ANP1, and it has blood sinusoids. That means once these blood cells are formed, they will travel through these openings or blood sinusoids, it says it down here, and enters the blood. So in our red bone marrow we have hematopoietic stem cells, and a stem cell is a precursor cell. So these hematopoietic stem cells can become any type of blood cell, whether it's an erythrocyte, whether it's a leukocyte, which is a white blood cell, and there's many different kinds, or it will take the lineage to become a platelet. So in this video we're going to be concerned with hematopoietic stem cells that become erythrocytes. So there are a lot of steps here in the formation of the red blood cell. Erythropoiesis would be the formation of the red blood cell. I'm not going to really require you to know these middle steps in here specifically, but there's some important steps that we should know and important concepts here. First is, well, here's the stem cell, the hematopoietic stem cell. This stem cell can become any type of blood cell. But once it becomes this, a proerythroblast, it's committed. It must become an erythrocyte. Now the stem cell can take other routes, but the proerythroblast route is a committed stage for the erythrocyte. Then it's going to go through these second phases of development. This is a developmental pathway. You can see it changing, but a big thing that happens here in these 4 steps that I'm just generalizing is that it loses the nucleus. And once that happens, it becomes an immature red blood cell, and we call that, importantly, a reticulocyte. And we have reticulocytes that actually enter our blood. Blood cells, red blood cells that are not fully mature yet. And it says about 2% of all your erythrocytes in your blood are reticulocytes. They just haven't become erythrocytes yet. Reticulocytes in the blood are helpful during blood chemistries or blood counts to determine the rate at which our body is producing red blood cells, because there should be about 1 to 2% of these reticulocytes in our blood. And then the reticulocytes break down the rest of their organelles and take on this mature shape of an erythrocyte, which can effectively carry gases throughout the body. If there are too few red blood cells, that can lead to decreased oxygen in the tissues, hypoxia. Too many, the blood will be too thick, or an increased blood viscosity. You can see how many are made per second in the body. And the balance between red blood cell production and destruction, which we'll get to in a few minutes, destruction of red blood cells, will depend on hormones, one of which we're going to go over in a second, and dietary requirements as well, like iron. The hormone that controls erythropoiesis, red blood cell formation, is erythropoietin, or EPO, and it stimulates forming red blood cells. It causes them to mature faster as well. So what happens is this erythropoietin, or EPO, is produced and released by our kidneys. Now it's always being released by our kidneys at a small amount, and that maintains that normal rate, basal rate, or normal rate of red blood cell production. The kidneys are constantly producing this factor, hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF, and what that does is, or I should say what's happening to it, is that we have enzymes in our kidneys that destroy HIF. But when our oxygen levels are low in our body, those enzymes cannot destroy or degrade HIF. So HIF will accumulate, and that's what triggers EPO release. The hormone gets released into the blood, and that increases the rate of erythropoiesis, or red blood cell formation. So just the opposite, if we have too many erythrocytes or high oxygen levels, because remember those are intimately related, because the more red blood cells, the more hemoglobin, the more binding of oxygen. So if we have too many of that, well, EPO production and release will be inhibited. Also, this hormone that we learned last chapter, testosterone, enhances EPO production. So here's our negative feedback scale, which we've seen quite a few times, ANP1 and a few times now in ANP2. There's an imbalance from normal blood oxygen to hypoxia, decreased blood oxygen, therefore less red blood cells, less hemoglobin available. So when there's low oxygen levels, the kidneys will release EPO. EPO stimulates the red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, more hemoglobin, more oxygen carrying capability, therefore oxygen levels to the tissues are normal again. You may have heard of athletes using EPO, artificial EPO, especially in cycling and runners. EPO will increase their red blood cell production, or erythropoiesis, which improves performance. This can be dangerous. You can see what it can cause: clotting, stroke, or heart failure. And the last slide of this video includes the dietary requirements for erythropoiesis. Of course, with all cells, we need our organic components, amino acids, lipids, carbohydrates. For our DNA synthesis, B12 and folic acid is important. And specifically for erythropoiesis, we need iron because of the hemoglobin requirement for iron. Most of the iron in our body is found on hemoglobin. The rest is in these other lymphoid organs, or liver, spleen, and bone marrow. Free iron, not bound to anything, is toxic in our body. So if they're not bound to hemoglobin, they'll be stored with proteins or bound to proteins. So sometimes you'll see words like ferritin, hemosiderin. That is iron bound to different proteins in different areas of the body.